Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to paint watercolor cherry blossoms. Cherry blossoms are one of the birth month flowers for the month of March, and I cannot wait to show you my easy trick for painting perfect cherry blossoms every time. For this piece, I'm using Arches 140 pound cold press watercolor paper, my limited palette of cad yellow, quin magenta, cerulean, indigo, and sap green watercolors. And I will also be using a size 10 and a size 4 round brush interchangeably, and you'll see why in just a second. So here's the trick. We're first going to start with a watery but very pigmented drop of magenta, and we are going to do 5 drops, leaving the center open. And if you've been with me for a while, maybe 3-ish years ago, I had a viral video about this technique, and I have seen it used many times since, and I'm so excited you guys love this technique. So you do 5 concentrated, very pigmented dots of watercolor, and I'm using my size 4 round brush for that, so I get the very pigmented fine dot. And then I use my size 10 with just pure water to pull that paint out into the petals. Now, the reason I love this trick is because if you look at pictures of cherry blossoms, it's a very light, delicate pink flower, and so this is a great way to get that watery light effect with watercolor without having to use paint to paint the petals. We're really using water to pull the pigment out of that dot, and then the center stays very concentrated. So we're just pulling it out into petal shapes that are kind of like rounded triangles, and we can leave some space between the petals, or you can connect them and just keep it very simple. You can keep your cherry blossoms like this, but I love the added detail that that magenta center gives. So I'm going to pick up my size 4 again, dip back into that really pigmented magenta color, and tap that into the center of the petals, just exactly where those dots were, while the petals are still wet, so we get just a deepening of color. And I use this opportunity to kind of fix up the edges of the petal right there in the center and make them look all nice and neat while still keeping the center open for the center details we're going to paint later. And then I always think once you've painted the perfect flower that's open and positioned perfectly so you can tell it's a cherry blossom, you can have fun with the different flowers on this branch. So cherry blossoms are on a tree, and so these are going to be on a branch, so we're trying to make some that are bunched together and some that are a little bit more separate. So I painted these 5 concentrated dots closer to the first flower so that we can kind of tuck these watery petals underneath the first flower. So when we get to the petals that are going to be connected or underneath that first flower, you can either connect them, but I try to leave a little bit of white space so that we can see some distinction between each flower so we can tell they're separate. And it's kind of perfect because the dot right here is so concentrated that this petal is a little bit darker just right underneath that first flower, and so it almost looks shadowed. So works out perfectly. And then we're going to dip back into the concentrated magenta and tap that on the inside of each of the petals while everything is still wet. And then we can move on to another flower. So this flower is, maybe you're seeing it more from the side and one of the petals is more closed. So we're only going to do 3 dots, but in the same way we're going to grab some more water, create the triangular rounded petals, bringing the pigment out, but we're only going to do 3 this time. And where the last flower was kind of tucked in, this flower is more that the petals are folded up. And so after we create these 3 petals, we're going to use the paint that's already on our brush, this watery pink, and just create a more flat, elongated petal. It's almost like a banana or a moon shape just across that edge, and that gives us the impression that we can see some of the petals from the center, but that there are some petals that are more folded up and we're seeing it from the side. Now we're creating a bunch here, and so we want to also create the illusion that there are petals on the sides that we can't see the centers of. So I need to create that really watery wash of pink color on my palette first before I create some of these side petals. So this one on the side here, I just added a bunch of water to my magenta before I created some petal shapes that are pointing to the right without the center being shown. And the way you can do that is by creating petal shapes that are kind of fanned to the right side, and then tiny little petal shapes above it to represent the other petals in the back. Now we're creating a flower that's a little bit more separate. So I'm thinking that there is a bunch of flowers in the center, and as we get to the end of our branch, maybe there's a flower that's more off on its own. So we're just doing that regular technique of the 5 pigmented dots and pulling that color out with water, and then going back in with the concentrated magenta to tap into the centers while everything is still wet. And I also wanted to create the idea that there are flowers that are more separate above this bunch. So as the branch is coming down from the top of the page and ending towards the bottom of the page, there's another couple of flowers that are grouped separate from this main center bunch that we have. Also, thankfully, my flowers over here were not completely dried, so I added that magenta to the center that I wanted to maintain while the flower petals were still wet. So I'm creating another flower that is kind of in full view using those 5 concentrated dots, and again, my size 10 brush to pull that pigment out with just clean water. This is a very repetitive process with the 5 dots and the pulling out of the water, but I think it's what makes painting cherry blossoms so easy and fun, because you can get really good at that process by doing this over and over again and continuing to try and experiment with this idea of pulling pigment out just by using clean water. So you might have to try on your paper and with your specific paints the different amounts of water control you're going to need to achieve this technique. I wanted to add another flower to the bunch to balance out this center bunch, and so I added a lot of water to my magenta mixture to get a flower that's more open but definitely to the side of us. So I'm just painting 3 petals that are kind of curved and open, but we cannot see the center of this flower. So we just can keep those really simple and without any of the magenta detail. Now that we have all of the flowers for this branch, we're going to paint the branch. With my limited palette of colors, I like to mix my own brown using magenta, the cad yellow, some of the sap green, because sap green and magentas are opposite on the color wheel, so they'll dull each other, making it a lovely, lovely brown. You could even add indigo or ultramarine blue to get a deeper, cooler wood color. And so once I've got that color, I'm still using my size 10 to place this branch in some of the openings between our flowers. And the great thing about cherry blossoms is it doesn't have to be a straight branch. It looks a little bit more natural if there's some crooks and angles in the painting of the branch. Also, if some of your flowers are not completely dry and you get a little bit of the blending, I think it looks really cool and it adds to that watercolor effect. And because we've painted the flowers so long ago, it shouldn't be too much of a blend. Just a nice light brown in those pink petals I think looks really nice, especially if you've mixed your own color using magenta, which kind of ties back into the color of the flower. While my branch is still wet, I'm mixing more magenta and some indigo into my brown mixture to give it a more cool tone, and I'm placing this cooler shadow on just the right side of the branch, again letting everything bleed and blend into the flowers and into the branch to give some depth so that the branch doesn't look flat. From what I read about cherry blossoms is that the flowers come first and then the leaves come second. So typically there are no leaves and blossoms at the same time. Please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below. But the stems from the branch to the flowers and the little buds that create the that turn into the blossoms are this really beautiful light bright yellow green. So I'm mixing cad yellow and some sap green to get this beautiful light color. I started with my size 10 brush and then knew I needed to go down to the size 4 to really get those details very fine and precise. I'm using the tip of my brush and very light pressure to do these very thin stems connecting the flowers to the branch. And I'm just keeping it very simple. And sometimes I like to just swipe with my finger if something goes awry. Sometimes that's the quickest way to fix something in watercolor while it's still wet. And I just love this really light, bright yellow-green peeking out between all of these beautiful pink flowers. And then here down at the end of the branch, I did a little bud just right at the tip, which I thought was a nice effect. And I did another bud towards the other end of the branch, trying to balance out the amount of green we have without putting too much green so that the pink stays the main character. And then to add depth to the greenery while it is still wet, I added sap green to my original mixture and then just tapped that into the green areas. And it was all still wet that it flowed very easily, but I would say keep the contrasting darker color to a minimum to avoid getting rid of your lighter values. Now we're going to work on the centers of the cherry blossoms. I am rinsing my brush, dabbing it on my paper towel, and picking up my cad yellow in a very highly concentrated wash of this yellow. It's very creamy and very thick. And I am placing that in the centers kind of haphazardly. I just want lots of yellow in the center, kind of doing these quick line strokes, but not really needing it to be a precise line. I just want there to be lots of yellow color for the centers, and then we can kind of define the yellow centers with more details later. But because it's such a bright and airy color, we don't necessarily need super distinct details at this point in the yellow color. I just want to kind of get it in there and make it very obvious that it's there. Now I'm going to rinse my brush, tap it on a paper towel, and with that deep magenta wood color that we made for the branch, I'm going to add a little bit more magenta so it's a very creamy, thick color, and I am going to tap at the ends of my yellow lines and up onto the pink petals quick dots for the stamen of the cherry blossom. Now, I want to make sure that most of these dots are in kind of that magenta ring that we have at the end of our flower petals, but we do need to bring some onto the light pink part of our flower petals so that we can see the stamen just a little bit more at the end of the yellow filaments that we painted. So that's just a way to draw your eye in and to be a little bit more curious about what is there because we can see it a little bit more crisp, those stamen dots on the light pink. You don't necessarily want to do too many, just enough that it looks full and beautiful and like there's lots of little stamen on the end of these filaments. And definitely don't put any on the light pink petals on these flowers that we're viewing more from the side. Those petals that are covering up the center or that are the closest towards us are not going to have any of these stamen dots on them. Now we want to make sure that our flower petals don't lay too flat, but we don't want to add so much detail to these petals that we lose the light airiness of cherry blossoms. So I'm just adding very light washes of pink to some of the flowers, especially the ones that we're viewing from the side and maybe need a little bit more contour or interest as they're kind of curving away from us, or where some of these petals are tucked in underneath each other, we can kind of add some dimension by creating a tiny bit of pink wash for shadow. Don't forget that if you go into these details with too heavy of a wash, you can always rinse your brush, tap it on a paper towel, and lift the color back out to achieve more of that light, airy look. Now we are going to actually mix cad yellow in with our magenta to create more of an orange color, just to finish off the centers of these flowers with a more detailed filament stroke. So we did that base yellow that brings a lot of light, bright color, and then we did those stamen at the very end, and now we're going to just outline some of the detail for the filaments with this more orange pink color. I'm doing this very lightly, and I'm not feeling the need to connect every end stamen to a filament. Some of these stamen can just be floating in the air, and it gives a nice organic look. The filament detail that I'm doing now is just to give more of a feeling of the lines that are there without just yellow blobs. So we're kind of defining and outlining some of that yellow without needing to put every filament in its place. And our cherry blossoms are finished. I hope you enjoyed this. If you are painting this for the month of March, you can write March and cherry blossoms on it. If you're just painting it because you love cherry blossoms, you can hang this up now because you did awesome. Thank you so much for being here today while we painted cherry blossoms with my 5-dot technique that I think paints cherry blossoms perfect every time. I hope you learned a lot and enjoyed this, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye.